The terrifying truth is that in the Wild West, you rarely died from a lead bullet in a glorious shootout. Don't let the movies fool you. What really swallowed tens of thousands of lives was the rotting from a tiny scratch, the stinking plagues, and the executioners masquerading as doctors. If it were you, you wouldn't survive 24 hours in this lawless territory. This is no fairy tale. This is hell on earth. The silver screen paints a picture of heroic cowboys, shining tin stars, and dramatic gunfights at high noon. But the frontier was a brutal, merciless landscape where the environment itself was actively trying to extinguish your existence. The air you breathed, the dirt beneath your boots, and the very water that quenched your thirst were teeming with microscopic assassins. The history movies buried the fact that the Wild West was a suffocating nightmare of disease and decay. You think bounty hunters were the most terrifying thing on the Oregon Trail? No. The most terrifying thing was hiding right inside the sip of water you just drank. Imagine the year is 1850. You have packed your entire life into a creaking wooden wagon, lured by the promise of fertile land and gold in California. You join a massive caravan, a crawling city of desperate souls pushing into the great unknown. The journey is agonizing. The sun is a blazing furnace, beating down on the unforgiving desert sand. The wind howls, carrying choking clouds of dust that settle deep in your lungs. But the physical exhaustion is nothing compared to the psychological terror that lay in the dark shadows of the frontier. Nearly 10% of the hundreds of thousands of migrants who embarked on the Oregon Trail left their corpses to rot along the dirt path. It became a graveyard stretching for 2,000 miles. And 90% of those poor souls did not die from native attacks. Ruthless outlaws, or wild beasts. They were torn apart from the inside by the silent, stinking plague of cholera. It was a terrifying disease born of filth, thriving in the human feces and raw sewage that contaminated the scarce water sources along the trail. When thousands of people and animals travel the exact same path, camping in the exact same spots, the environment quickly turns into a toxic dungeon of decay. The land was completely lawless, and so was nature. The horror of cholera was its breathtaking speed and absolute ruthlessness. You could wake up feeling perfectly healthy, full of hope for the journey ahead. And by nightfall, you would be a lifeless, shriveled husk. The bacteria invaded your intestines, releasing a toxin that forced your body to aggressively purge all its fluids. The vomiting and diarrhea were uncontrollable, violent, and completely humiliating. Imagine the chilling, suffocating panic as you watch a family member succumb to the unseen enemy. You try to give them water, but their body rejects it, expelling it back out in a terrifying stream. Within hours, severe dehydration sets in. Their skin loses all elasticity, wrinkling like wet parchment. Their blood thickens into a dark, sluggish sludge, causing their extremities to turn a terrifying shade of black and blue. Their eyes sink so deep into their skull that they look like a living skeleton. The muscle cramps are so agonizing that the victim's screams pierce the quiet night of the frontier. A desperate, guttural sound of pure torture that will haunt the survivors forever. There was no cure. There were no sanitized hospitals or intravenous fluids. There were only terrified, helpless onlookers trapped in a waking nightmare. The psychological toll was unbearable and completely broke the human spirit. The fear of infection created a paranoid, dog-eat-dog mentality where survival instincts overrode all human decency. To protect the rest of the wagon train, the sick were often quarantined in the back of the wagons, bouncing violently over the rocky terrain while they slowly died in pure agony. Sometimes, the desperation was so profound that infected individuals were simply left behind on the side of the trail. They were handed a canteen of contaminated water and a loaded Colt 45 to finish themselves off before the coyotes and wolves found them in the darkness. The trail was littered with hasty, shallow graves dug by exhausted, weeping mothers. The stench of decomposing flesh hung heavy in the humid air, a constant, sickening reminder of your own mortality. You were walking through an open-air slaughterhouse, where the executioner was invisible and completely indiscriminate. You did not need to cross paths with a notorious outlaw to meet a violent, bloody end. You only needed to be thirsty. You only needed to drink from a muddy puddle where a sick pioneer had washed their soiled, disease-ridden clothing 3 days prior. The human body, deprived of water and ravaged by brutal bacteria, would literally collapse in on itself. It was a torturous way to die. Your dignity was completely stripped away as your body violently emptied itself, leaving you lying in your own filth, too weak to even swat away the flies gathering around your sunken, unblinking eyes. This was the dark reality of Western expansion that history books try to soften. It was not a glorious conquest of the wilderness fueled by bravery. It was a desperate, bloody fight for survival against a landscape that wanted you dead. When the cold shadow of death is hovering right over your shoulder, human desperation takes over completely. A dying man will swallow absolutely anything if you tell him it is a miracle cure. And in the lawless Wild West, there was no shortage of smiling predators waiting in the dusty streets, eager to sell you a bottle of pure poison. If you miraculously avoided the cholera on the trail, and if you somehow managed to keep all your limbs away from the rusty saw of the town butcher, you still had to face the suffocating terror of frontier pharmacies. Do not let the charming, fast-talking medicine men from the movies fool you. These traveling salesmen were not eccentric healers bringing modern science to the frontier. They were cold-blooded executioners selling bottled nightmares to terrified, ignorant pioneers who just wanted to stop the pain. The mid-19th century was the golden age of patent medicines. A completely unregulated hell on earth where anyone could mix toxic chemicals with cheap alcohol, bottle it in dark glass, and call it a universal cure. There was no government oversight, no ingredient labels, and absolutely no concept of patient safety. The most famous of these deadly concoctions was snake oil. The original snake oil, brought by Chinese laborers, actually had some mild anti-inflammatory properties from water snakes. But greedy American con artists quickly stole the name and started brewing massive vats of absolute garbage. They mixed cheap mineral oil, red pepper to give it a burning sensation, turpentine, and camphor. They sold it from the back of painted wagons to desperate cowboys suffering from arthritis, assuring them it would cure everything from joint pain to blindness. It did nothing but burn their stomachs and empty their thin wallets. But snake oil was completely harmless compared to the true horrors hiding on the wooden shelves of the frontier apothecary. The terrifying truth is that the most popular, highly recommended medicines of the Wild West were actually massive doses of lethal heavy metals and highly addictive narcotics. If you had a lingering fever, a stomach ache, or even just a general sense of fatigue, the local doctor would almost certainly prescribe you a heavy dose of calomel. Calomel was a tasteless, white powder that doctors carried in little glass vials. They called it a miracle drug. It was, in fact, pure mercurous chloride. They were intentionally feeding their patients toxic, brain-rotting mercury. The prevailing medical theory was that the body needed to be completely purged to expel the sickness. And calomel definitely purged you. It triggered violent, uncontrollable vomiting and explosive diarrhea that completely drained the last remaining drops of life from a sick patient. But the true horror of mercury poisoning was a slow, agonizing process. If you took calomel for a few weeks, the heavy metal would begin to destroy your soft tissues from the inside out. Your gums would swell into painful, black masses. Your mouth would constantly fill with thick, metallic saliva. Your teeth would become completely loose and literally fall out of your head, landing with a sickening clatter on the wooden floor. Eventually, the mercury would eat away at your jawbone, causing the bone itself to rot and crumble while you were still alive, leaving your face permanently collapsed and horribly disfigured. You thought you were buying a cure, but you were actually paying a con artist to slowly dissolve your skull. And then there was the silent, suffocating nightmare of laudanum. It was an incredibly potent mixture of opium dissolved in strong alcohol, tinted a dark, reddish-brown. It was legally available everywhere, sold in every general store, salon, and pharmacy across the frontier. It was the absolute ultimate painkiller in a world completely dominated by physical suffering. Exhausted pioneers drank it to soothe their aching muscles. Cowboys chugged it to numb the terrifying agony of infected gunshot wounds. But the most horrifying reality of laudanum was how it was aggressively marketed to terrified, exhausted mothers. Imagine a dark, suffocating wooden cabin in the middle of a freezing winter night. A young mother is completely alone, isolated in the lawless territory, holding a screaming, feverish infant. The baby is teething, or perhaps suffering from a mild stomach bug. But the constant, ear-piercing crying is driving the exhausted mother to the very edge of madness. Out of pure, blind desperation, she reaches for a small, dark bottle labeled soothing syrup. She pours a generous spoonful of the thick, sweet-smelling liquid and forces it into the child's mouth. Within minutes, the screaming completely stops. The infant's eyes roll back. Their breathing becomes incredibly shallow, and they slip into a deep, motionless sleep. The mother sighs in relief, thinking she has found a miracle. But the chilling reality is that she just fed her child a massive, unregulated dose of raw morphine and alcohol. These heavily marketed soothing syrups swallowed the lives of countless frontier children. Many simply slipped into a dark, narcotic coma and silently suffocated in their cribs because the opium completely suppressed their respiratory system. If they somehow survived the nightly doses of poison, they would grow up physically addicted to raw opium before they could even walk, shivering and screaming in agonizing withdrawal the moment the bottle ran empty. The frontier was a ruthless meat grinder that did not care about your age. The very medicine meant to protect the vulnerable was actually an invisible, silent assassin, destroying entire families from the inside out and turning the Wild West into a massive, heavily medicated graveyard. The gold rush promised unimaginable wealth, a glittering dream that pulled men from every corner of the globe. But the terrifying truth is that it actually dug a massive, open-air dungeon for tens of thousands of desperate dreamers. You might picture a rugged miner panning for gold in a sparkling mountain stream, but the reality of a frontier mining camp was a suffocating nightmare of filth, disease, and absolute moral decay. These booming settlements sprang up overnight, completely devoid of any infrastructure, sanitation, or basic human decency. They were not towns. They were chaotic, overcrowded refugee camps where human life was the cheapest commodity available. When thousands of desperate, greedy men crammed together into muddy valleys, the environment immediately turned toxic. There were no sewers, human waste, rotting animal carcasses, and toxic mining runoff were simply dumped into the exact same streams where people drew their drinking water. This lethal combination created a perfect, warm breeding ground for an invisible assassin that was just as deadly as cholera. It was the terrifying plague of typhoid fever. The bacteria thrived in the stinking mud, rapidly infecting the exhausted miners. Typhoid did not kill you quickly. It slowly baked your brain with a relentless, blazing fever, causing severe abdominal pain and a terrifying rash of rose-colored spots across your chest. You would lie in a damp, freezing canvas tent, covered in your own sweat and filth, completely alone. Your fellow miners, consumed by the blinding fever of gold, would simply ignore your agonizing groans. In a gold camp, compassion was a fatal weakness. If you stopped digging to help a dying man, you might miss your chance at a fortune. So, they left you to rot in the dark. But typhoid was not the only executioner waiting in the mud. The severe lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in these remote camps brought back an ancient, terrifying maritime plague: scurvy. It was a completely preventable disease. But in the lawless Wild West, fresh food was incredibly scarce. Your body, completely deprived of vitamin C, would literally begin to break down and fall apart on a cellular level. Your old, healed wounds would terrifyingly reopen and seep dark fluids. Your gums would swell until your teeth simply fell out while you were trying to eat hardtack. You would eventually die, a slow, incredibly painful death, your body slowly dissolving from the inside out while surrounded by mountains of useless, cold gold. And if the microscopic plagues did not swallow you whole, the absolute brutality of the mining work itself surely would. Men were crushed by collapsing mine shafts, blown to pieces by unstable black powder explosions, or violently attacked in the dark for a single pocket of gold dust. The mortality rate in these camps was staggering, a testament to the absolute breakdown of human morality. It was a completely lawless territory where a man's life could be extinguished over a rigged game of cards or a dirty look. When the gold veins finally dried up, the desperate men simply packed their bags and vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind thousands of shallow graves and empty, rotting wooden buildings. These once booming settlements were completely abandoned to the howling wind and the creeping desert sand, instantly transforming into eerie ghost towns. The silence in these ghost towns is deafening, a haunting reminder of the pure, unadulterated desperation that once stained their wooden floorboards. The terrifying truth is that the Wild West was not conquered by brave heroes with shining tin stars. It was a brutal meat grinder that swallowed millions of lives and spit out only the most ruthless, lucky, and hardened survivors. The romanticized image of the heroic cowboy is a comfortable lie that the movies buried us in. The reality was a daily, suffocating struggle against an environment that actively wanted you dead, surrounded by desperate men who would eliminate you for a warm meal. The lucky ones in the Wild West were the ones who took a lead bullet straight to the heart and died instantly. The unlucky ones survived the gunfight, only to face the rusty saw of the executioner in a white coat, the toxic poison of a medicine man, or the slow, agonizing decay of an invisible plague. If you somehow managed to survive all of this, you still had to deal with the supposed lawmen. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey into the dark history of the frontier. What do you think would be the most horrifying part of living in the Wild West? Let me know in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our next descent into the darkness. In the next video, we will rip away the shining tin star and reveal the terrifying truth about the frontier sheriffs, the ruthless executioners who were often more psychopathic than the outlaws they were hunting. You will not look at a Western movie the same way ever again.